Hello, welcome to the webinar, Tax Filing Issues for Immigrants. This is our 2018 update. All of you who are participating are going to be in listen-only mode. However, you can enter any questions that you may have into the chat box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of our presentations. The webinar is brought to you today by the National Immigration Law Center. I am Jackie Vimo. We're also co-hosted by Unidos US, and Samantha Vargas Papi is on behalf of Unidos US, and also John Wanchak from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. We'll all be presenting to you today on different aspects of immigrant issues around tax filing. All right, so without further ado, make sure. Oh, there we go. The goals for the webinar are to educate providers and community organizations about ITIN renewal process in order to get the word out to communities. The ITIN renewals began last year. We did a webinar about that issue this year. Last year, and we've had one whole year of experience with that, which John will talk to you a little bit about. We're also going to be providing an update about issues that ITIN filers in particular might be experiencing and changes in the recently passed tax bill. We're going to address concerns about tax filing for immigrants, including ITIN filers and individuals granted DACA, and correct any misinformation about ITIN renewals and tax filing. So we're going to start really with a broad overview from Samantha, who's going to talk to us about some background on immigrant tax contributions in the United States. I'm going to talk about the current political climate and some of the tax bill changes, and we'll be joined by my colleague from NILC, Gabrielle Lessard, who's going to talk about the individual mandate penalty, the ACA, and changes under the tax bill. And then John Wanchak will lead us through the current status of ITIN renewals, who's required to renew, when to renew, and what happens if you don't renew. And then we'll share some resources communities can use and take questions and answers. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Samantha.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today for this webinar. I'll kick us off with a quick background on immigrant tax contributions. I'm certain that our attendees today all know this, but I just want to make it abundantly clear that we know, and the data shows, that immigrants, including those who are undocumented, make tremendous contributions to our nation. One way that they do that is through the tax code and by paying federal, state, and local taxes. Their share is significant and without a doubt adds to and bolsters our economy. We know that all wage earners, including undocumented immigrants in the workforce, are required to pay federal taxes. The IRS provides individual taxpayer identification numbers, or ITIN, to people who are ineligible for a Social Security number so that they can comply with tax laws. And honestly, that's one of the biggest reasons why many undocumented immigrants pay federal taxes. They really want to abide by the law and do their civic duty. Before I get into some data on their tax contributions, though, I'll just say quickly that we at Unidos US have long focused on tax advocacy, and the tax bill and continued attacks on ITIN filers really concern us, largely because the majority of the people affected by the restrictions we'll talk to you about today are Latino and are mixed status families. So the potential effect on the Latino community, as well as the immigrant community, of course, are huge. But these changes not only affect adult filers, we're talking about children and families as well. And so in that vein, we'll continue with our listeners and other groups sponsoring the call to advocate on the issue. So quickly, let's go through the federal contribution. We'll start there. This includes payroll taxes into Medicare and Social Security. A Treasury study that came out a few years ago showed that at the time, 3 million unauthorized workers, including ITIN filers, paid over $13 billion into the Social Security program. I mean, one important thing to note about the significant contribution is that while undocumented immigrants contribute to the programs, they're not eligible to receive benefits. So this means that their contributions are really not only supporting the program, but creating a net positive effect on the program's financial security and helping sustain that program. In that same year, the same study showed that for 3 million federal tax returns filed with ITINs accounted for over $870 million in income taxes alone. So on the state and local side, we also know that immigrants really do make strong contributions to state and local ledgers each year through a combination of sales and excise taxes, like those on gas, but also personal income and property taxes. The Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, ITEP, they put out and recently updated last year a great and thorough report on state and local tax contributions of undocumented immigrants. They estimated that a collective contribution of $11.74 billion is made by undocumented immigrants to state and local taxes each year. Their data shows that these contributions range from just over $550,000 in Montana, where there's about 1,000 undocumented immigrants, to more than $3 billion in California, where more than 3 million undocumented immigrants live. An interesting piece to me is that they also broke out information on DACA recipients, who alone pay about $2 billion in state and local taxes. One thing to point out is that according to the study, those DACA recipients pay a larger share of their incomes in state and local taxes than the top 1% of taxpayers do. So I thought that that was a fairly striking figure to take note of. So while there's clearly an already large contribution to our economy via taxes, estimates from the Congressional Budget Office and others support that undocumented immigrants can contribute even more with full immigration reform. If it's done correctly, reform at the federal level can help decrease the deficit and create more than $450 billion in additional revenue in a decade. So there's a lot more to say about this stuff. I'll stop there and hand the presentation over to my colleagues to dig into the tax bill itself and what it means for ITIN filers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for giving us a broad overview. Now I'm going to pivot to the issues that some immigrant tax filers are facing right now, particularly in the current political environment. Since the election last year, we've been receiving many calls from undocumented immigrants, from green card holders, from even U.S. citizens and mixed status families, asking questions about what possible changes might be upcoming, impacting immigrant tax filers, and what they should be concerned about, and what they need to know in order to meet their obligations as taxpayers. So just as Samantha mentioned, ITINs allow individuals who are ineligible for Social Security numbers to pay taxes. It's important to know that having an ITIN doesn't necessarily mean that you are undocumented. There are a number of different examples who need ITINs, including non-resident aliens who are required to file U.S. tax returns, dependents or spouses of U.S. citizens, or immigrants, and dependents or spouses of non-resident visa holders. I think that the important thing to mention is that under current law, we have really strong confidentiality provisions for tax filing held by the IRS, and the relevant code 6103 is cited there. I think we are, I want to preface this by saying that we still feel very confident that those protections remain in place, but also want to acknowledge that there is a great deal of uncertainty in this new environment. and that we are closely monitoring any changes that may be happening with regards to data sharing that may be occurring across federal agencies or state and local agencies, and we'll be advising you if we know of any changes. But up until now, we are confident that, well, one is that there's a law that protects the confidentiality of that data, and we are not aware of any breaches, and the agency remains firmly committed to protecting taxpayer data confidentiality. So again, it is possible that Congress or the Trump administration could make changes to existing laws and regulations. And so many people are asking whether or not they should make decisions based on that possibility. So the way we are recommending that that either providers or community members talk to their clients or their families or members of their community is to really consider what the risks are and what the benefits are of filing taxes with an individual taxpayer identification number. So I think the first thing to start with is just that if you already have an ITIN number, the IRS already has your information. So you're not necessarily increasing your exposure if you, for example, renew your ITIN or file taxes with an ITIN. Of course, if you've recently changed your address, that could provide new information, but really there is no benefit whatsoever in trying to call the IRS and saying, can you take me off the rolls because you're already on there. And that's a common thing that we've been hearing. Again, not all ITIN filers are undocumented, so filing taxes with an ITIN is not a big sign that says that you are undocumented. It does not confirm your immigration status. And there are some benefits to it. So one of the benefits of an ITIN to consider and weigh alongside some concerns folks have are, regardless of your immigration status, federal tax laws require you to file taxes if you're receiving income unless you're exempt. And you're not exempted from paying taxes because of an immigration status. I think, as Samantha mentioned, paying taxes in ITIN is a way to contribute to the economy. And more importantly, when you're adjusting status, in the moment that your immigration case, if and when you do have an opportunity to adjust your immigration status, they're going to look at many different factors. And three of those factors are good moral character, work history, and physical presence. It turns out that having paid your tax, filed your taxes, and having tax returns is a way of meeting those three requirements. It shows that you've been working. It shows that you have good moral character because you pay your taxes, you contribute to your economy, and you follow tax laws. And it also shows you are physically present in the country. So it can really be helpful. And again, we don't know what the status of immigration reform is right now, but we know that in the event that there is a comprehensive immigration reform or any kind of immigration reform, that these types of documents have been extremely useful. We know this from the experience back in 1986 during the last time we had a major legalization program. Undocumented immigrants, other immigrants who are here lawfully present can also take advantage of tax credits. So many immigrants, if they forego paying taxes, may actually lose out on tax returns that they're entitled to under the law. There's also specific issues around health insurance, and Gabrielle will talk about this a little bit later, whether or not, how this works, but there are a number of complicated things that have recently changed with the tax bill. But one, some individuals may be able to receive insurance premium tax credits under quote unquote Obamacare. And then we have the individual mandate, which has recently changed, and I'll leave that for Gabrielle to explain. The other issue is many workers may receive settlements resulting from employment-related disputes, and for that reason, you want to be able to have an ITIN number in order to be able to claim your settlement. So that's the benefit. So the next big piece that we're getting a lot of questions around is, what if I have DACA? What if DACA is, now that DACA has officially been rescinded, but is also stuck in court, what does this mean for me in terms of tax filing? We know that many people with DACA have lost work authorization already since September, and we acknowledge that the future of the program is uncertain. Of course, We are continuing to work in Washington to try and find a solution, but as of right now, it is not resolved. So a few things to bear in mind. And again, we don't have definitive answers about this because the DACA program has not fully been terminated yet. It is stuck in court, and we hope that there'll be a resolution, and we'll have more information once we have more clarity around what's going to happen next. But the important thing that I get lots of questions around is, should I continue to use my Social Security number even if my work authorization expires? So the important thing to note there is that the Social Security number that's issued to DACA grantees remains valid indefinitely. So many people may have previously filed taxes with an ITIN number rather before being receiving DACA, and they should no longer use that ITIN number. Once you receive a Social Security number, your ITIN is no longer valid. You will continue to use that Social Security number. It's important to note that under tax law, regardless of your employment authorization status, that your employer has to continue to file taxes if he or she is responsible to do so, and withhold employment taxes for you for the wages you received while employed, and you're still legally obligated to file taxes and pay taxes on your earnings, of course, unless you're exempt. So that is what we know about DACA and tax filing. Again, don't have a lot of clear answers because, again, we're hoping very much that the program will not be ended or will be converted into some kind of a legalization program. But stay tuned. We will keep you updated if you've registered for this program and give you updates. The other major change that occurred in addition to the rescission of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. HR 1, as many of you may have heard, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in December of 2017 and signed by President Trump. It included a number of changes to our tax laws, but I'm going to only really emphasize two of them that impact immigrant tax filers. One is eligibility for the child tax credit, and the second is changes to the individual mandate. So, move to the next slide. So for those of you who don't know, the child tax credit provides a credit of up to about $1,000 per child under age of 18, and if the child tax credit, also known as the CTC, exceeds taxes owed, families may receive some or all of the credit as a refund. That is known as the additional child tax credit, the ACTC, or the refundable CTC. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act, recently passed, denies the child tax credit, both the refundable and non-refundable portions, to immigrant children without a Social Security number. So prior to this bill being passed, and actually this continues to be true for this tax filing year. So if you are filing taxes now in 2018 for the 2017 tax year, you can still claim the child tax credit for your child if the child does not have a Social Security number. But beginning in the 2019 tax filing season, in order to claim the child tax credit, both portions, you are going to have a valid Social Security number for the child that you're claiming for the tax credit. So this provision, as many of the other individual tax provisions in the bill, will expire in 2025. So we'll have a few years to figure out what to do next with this. And it's important to know that if your child, if the child that is being claimed for the CTC has a Social Security number, it has to be issued before the due date of the filing of the return for that taxable year. I think the final piece to mention is that children who would otherwise qualify for the CTC, except that they lack a Social Security number, are eligible for the new non-refundable $500 family tax credit that was part of the new tax bill. And so that's important to know, that even though you might be losing the CTC, and that's going to have an impact on many, many families, especially mixed status families. So one thing to note is that if the parent who's claiming the child who has a Social Security number has an ITIN, they are allowed to claim it. So the requirement for the Social Security number does not follow the head of household or the person claiming the credit, it applies to the child under the age of 18, upon which the child tax credit eligibility is based. Again, I want to just reiterate, none of these changes go into effect until the 2019 tax filing season. So if you're just preparing taxes now for last year, this does not affect you. We will be seeing those changes in the 2018 next year tax year. So next, we have I'm going to talk. Gabrielle Lessard from our team is going to join us and talk about some of the changes to the individual mandate in the tax bill. Gabrielle, are you on?
Yes. Thanks, Jackie. Can you advance the slide, please?
Okay. Beyond the individual mandate slide, please.
Oh, I am not looking at the right thing. Okay. Sorry, folks. So it's been widely reported that the individual mandate portion of the Affordable Care Act was repealed by the tax law. And that's only partially correct. So just to lay the framework, I wanted to start by going back and reviewing what the individual mandate actually is. So the Affordable Care Act requires U.S. residents to have comprehensive health insurance unless they qualify for an exception, or pay a tax penalty that's referred to as a shared responsibility payment. There are multiple exceptions, including for people who had hardship, couldn't get an affordable offer of coverage, or people who were not lawfully present, and that includes, for purposes of the Affordable Care Act, DACA recipients who were excluded from the ACA. The compliance with the requirement to have the insurance or pay the penalty is tracked by the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS. So people report that they had insurance or file a form to claim the exemptions on their annual tax returns. Okay, next slide, please. Great, thank you. So what the tax law did was it eliminated the shared responsibility payment by just zeroing out the penalty amount. So people are no longer subject to a penalty if they don't have, or will no longer be subject to a penalty if they don't have coverage beginning in 2019. So this actually doesn't go into effect until the 2019 tax year. So you'll see it when you file returns in 2020. What was not changed was the legal obligation to have insurance and to report insurance. So we're waiting to see if any information comes from the IRS about modifications to the existing reporting requirements. But to date, none of that has been affected by the tax law.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you, Gabrielle. So if you have questions about that, we'll be returning to that in the Q&A section. Now we're going to move on to ITIN renewal requirements with John Wanchek, who's going to lead us in that section. John, take it away.
Thanks very much, and welcome everybody. So as Jackie mentioned, we're now into the second year of a congressionally required program to renew ITINs that have been previously issued. And so this year, two categories of ITINs are affected. They are any ITIN that's not been used to file a tax return for the previous 3 years. You know, people are filing returns right now for 2017. So ITINs that were not used in 2014, 15, or 16, they have been identified by the IRS and they are targeted for deactivation without notice. The second category is those ITINs that were issued before 2008, is the category that we're in, the oldest ITINs. And the way the IRS has identified these is by using the middle digit of the ITIN number itself. The ITIN number is like a Social Security number, except that they all start with 9. And so what the IRS has done in order to be accurate in sending out notices to people affected is they've used their internal codes that lets them know when the IRS originally issued the ITIN. And so they've got 4 groups this year, 70, 71, 72, or 80. If any of those digits are in the middle of the ITIN number, then that ITIN is expired and needs to be renewed. The IRS did send notification letters to everybody who has filed a return at least once in those 3 years that I mentioned. And that letter went out in August of last year, and it went out to individuals. It went out to individuals that had been filing before, and notifying them that they can renew their ITIN, and that, excuse me, my computer suddenly collapsed. Here we go, I'm back, I think. Yep. So if we go to the next slide that starts with expiring ITINs can be renewed, we'll be all right. And so those ITINs that I identified can be renewed during this filing season. And since people got their notices back in August, they could have renewed their ITIN before the end of the year as well. We don't know how many people took advantage of that. The previous year, about 100,000 people did. Those ITINs could also be renewed after this filing season. If someone is not filing a return this year, but has a reason to in a subsequent year, they can still renew it later on. And people who had the ITINs for the previous year's deactivation class, those were numbered 78 and 79 in the middle, even though they are expired, they could still be renewed using the same process for this current group. Now, what happens with tax returns that people with these ITINs that have been expired now, they file their tax return, those returns, the refunds from the tax credits and dependent exemptions that they might have received will be held until the ITIN is renewed. So the refund is not rejected, it is processed, and so it's important to go ahead and get the return in along with the renewal application. And so let's talk about how you can renew an ITIN on the next slide. And the process here is essentially the same as an application for a new ITIN, especially now that we're in the tax filing season, and it makes more sense to go ahead and send in a tax return along with the renewal application rather than doing it as a separate process, even though sending in a renewal application does not require a tax return to be attached to renew the ITIN. But since you want to get the tax return moving, it makes most sense in most cases to do that. And the IRS will send a filer who uses an expired ITIN with a notice explaining how to renew. And that process really is embodied in the IRS Form W-7 that is used for applications for the IRS individual tax identification number. That form was revised in September of 16. That's the form that you'll most quickly see when you look for forms on the IRS website. But just make sure you're using the most updated form. And also, people need to be reminded to be careful to check on that form the renew existing ITIN box, so the IRS knows you're renewing rather than sending in a new application, which goes through different hoops than a renewal. We've heard that was among the most common errors last year, people failing to check that box. And that would be, we would think that might even include return preparers who skip over that. Next, as many of you know, ITIN applications require particular identification documents for immigrants. And the documents that are required for ITIN renewal are no different than for a new application. So they're the fundamental identity and foreign status documents such as passport, a national ID card with a photo, birth certificate. The W-7 actually lists in detail those that are accepted. There's a wide range of documents that can be accepted for not only the primary taxpayer, but also for dependents who have ITINs that need to have their ITIN renewed. And for them, there needs to be as proof of residency in the United States, or if they're being claimed as a dependent living in Mexico or Canada, proof of residency in those countries. Again, the instructions for the Form W-7 lay that all out in considerable detail, and also provide information, which we have summarized on the next slide, about where to apply to get an ITIN renewed. So what a lot of people do, a surprising number, they mail their application directly to the IRS, and the sort of the downside that a lot of people feel on that is that they have to include in that application the original documents or certified copies that were issued, by the agency that issued the birth certificate, for instance. Those have to be sent as originals to the IRS, and so there's a risk. People fear that those documents may be lost, but the IRS is committed to returning those documents within 65 days by mail to the address that was on the application. Now, in addition to that, mailing it yourself, many IRS offices can verify some of the identity documents. And on our slide for renewal resources at the end of this presentation, there is a list of IRS offices that are able to do this kind of verification. You have to have an appointment with an IRS office these days. A lot of people are suspicious about going to an IRS office, and the issue is not that the IRS is going to be checking in security whether you have an ITIN or not before entering the IRS office. A lot of the IRS offices are in regular office buildings, and even though the IRS itself has security screening, it's not looking, looking to see if you're undocumented or not. However, some IRS offices are in federal buildings, including some that may have Homeland Security or ICE offices, and they have federal security officers and procedures. And so those may not be the best offices for someone with an ITIN to approach and be asked for identification. So that's just some word to the wise on picking IRS offices, if any are available to you, that are safest. In addition to that, there are certified, what are called certified acceptance agents. They're certified by the IRS. They're required to have training on doing ITIN applications and renewals. They can assist with the application, and if they're certified, they can also verify some of the key identification documents so that the taxpayer doesn't have to send the original document to the IRS. They can verify the legitimacy of these documents, make copies, and send that in with the application. Most of the certified acceptance agents are paid return preparers. So, one of the advantages of the IRS offices is that they don't charge anything, but the return preparer offices do charge fees for helping people with ITINs. There is, and again on our resource list, the IRS has provided a list of volunteer income tax assistance programs, free programs that also are certified to do this work and can verify documents. So you might look to see if there's any in your area to refer people to, so that it can be done without cost. Now, just want to underline, we've talked about whose ITINs have expired and are going to be getting a notice if they file a return right now. The next slide provides information about who doesn't need to renew now. And so anyone who has filed a return in the past 3 years, and the 2 digits in the middle of their number is not those 4, 70, 71, 72, or 80, they're not affected by this. In addition to that, anyone who is not required to file a return, doesn't have any plans to file a tax return, is not really otherwise affected. ITINs are used as identification numbers for bank accounts and on mortgage documents and loans. In some cases, they've been used as the ID number for a driver's license, for health records. This program of ITIN renewal and deactivation of old numbers does not affect any of those other uses. So the IRS is not, sending around lists of expired ITIN numbers to banks, for example. And the ITIN number, even if it's been expired, could still be used if you get an interest document, a 1099 interest document from a bank with that number. That's still going to be okay, and it's not going to snarl up your accounts. So the only effect it has is creating a barrier to filing a tax return that people may be very interested in doing. But if they're not, they're no longer working, they're disabled, they don't have income that requires them to file, it really has no impact on them. So the next slide is a little more detail about the notices about renewal and expiration that the IRS sent out. This year, the IRS sent out over 867,000 letters to households where there were ITIN holders, either the primary taxpayer or perhaps one or 2 other individuals in the household, such as children, who got ITINs around the same time. Again, these letters went to people that IRS had addresses for because they had filed returns at least once in the previous 3 years. Of course, some of those may have bounced back if people moved, and there was no forwarding address. So this doesn't guarantee that people got the notice, but IRS did make the effort. I mentioned that there was about 1.2 million ITINs expiring, and the balance there is for those folks that IRS picked up as having not filed in 2014, 15, or 16. So they picked up about 12 million people who last year who had not used their ITIN on a return up and through 2015. Well, now there's an extra year that's gone by, and IRS is able to identify people who have lapsed for the past 3 years now. Those folks were just deactivated without receiving a notice. If you want to get a picture of what's going on in your state in terms of numbers of these letters. There's a spreadsheet that the IRS has kindly provided that shows the number of letters that were sent out for each state, and it's broken down by the community and zip code in those states. And if you want to get a copy of that spreadsheet, you can contact me at my email address listed here, and I'd be glad to send that out to you. And just for information, these are the top states numerically that received the most of these ITIN notices. And I noticed, I think, that Georgia and North Carolina were new entries from the past year. So this kind of will follow what the patterns are for immigration and people applying for ITINs, as they get settled and want to file tax returns. So that will probably be looking different over the years. So the final slide here is our renewal resource list. Again, you're going to get this PowerPoint available to you, so you'll be able to look at this at your leisure. But these are all separate sources. There's not a lot of duplication here. So in order to see, what the notice looks like that people got in August, what the frequently asked questions are that IRS has listed, various other information, the links to the IRS offices that can handle an ITIN renewal, the free VITA sites, the acceptance agents that can do ITIN work. And by the way, there's a difference between certified acceptance agents and there's acceptance agents that are acknowledged by the IRS, but they haven't been certified to verify the documents. So if you'll find those at the IRS listing as well, and they can help do the application, but they're not going to be able to verify the documents and simply send in copies. The originals that would have to be sent in for the applications that they handle. So I think with that, we can move on to further discussion and questions.
Thanks so much, John. So we got a lot of questions. I think I'm going to take some just kind of basic ones and then turn it over to John for some of the ITIN renewal ones. Just to clarify, there was a question about that I said all wage earners are required to pay taxes unless you are exempt. And the individual asked, can you specify what the minimum income requirement is to be required to file taxes? For this year, there's a number of, I'm not going to be able to read every single one of them. I'm happy to share the chart with you. But if you're single and filing single and under 65, the gross income is $10,400. If you are single, filing single and age 65 or older, it's $11,950. And it kind of just again, married filing jointly, both under 65, both spouses, $20,800, and qualifying widower with dependent child under 65 is $16,750. But I'm happy to send around that chart for folks to check to see if they're required to pay taxes, to file taxes.
And Jackie, just to add to that, that chart is found in the early pages of the 1040 instructions for tax filing. So it's readily available in the IRS 1040 instructions.
Thanks, that's an important clarification. So the next one is, if you file your taxes with an invalid ITIN, does the IRS return your taxes? Such a series of questions. Does checking the validity of an, well, the next question is, how can you check whether or not your ITIN is still valid? And does checking the validity of an ITIN alert the government, presumably to your status? I can either answer that, or John, do you want to take that?
Well, I think first of all, pay attention to these numbers that have been expired. If those middle digits are in your ITIN, then you can assume you've been expired. If you haven't filed a return, in the past 3 years, you can assume your ITIN has expired. That's the simplest way to do that. You know, the other thing you can do is, you know, file your tax return. And if you can't figure that out, file your return and see what happens. Because the only thing that will happen is if it's expired, the IRS will tell you and tell you how to go about renewing it. And if it hasn't expired, then it's just going to go ahead and process the return. So, you know, if you're, and I wanted to mention before, there's no penalty other than slowing down your tax return for having an expired ITIN. You're allowed to renew it and without penalty.
And that's actually, there's two other kind of sub-questions that were in there. I just want to make sure I address them. So someone said, well, what happens if you file with an invalid ITIN? What happens? John, you just answered that. They asked, does it slow down the whole return or just the refund? And the answer is both. And then the other question being, does checking the validity of my ITIN or filing taxes with an ITIN alert DHS, for example, or immigration agents to my immigration status? The answer to that is no, because of the confidentiality protections. Again, we are closely monitoring this to ensure that no data sharing is occurring between the IRS and DHS. And in the event that such a thing does happen, we would, of course, alert everyone. But right now we are, you know, the law is that they cannot be sharing that information. We're not aware of any instances of ITIN data or IRS data being shared with DHS. And then just one other really quick question was, is the ITIN tax filing season the 2018 or 2019? 2019 tax filing season is when you file your 2018 taxes. So this year, right now, February 2018, is the 2018 tax filing season, and we are filing our taxes from last year. The tax filing season just opened a couple days ago, last week of January, but we're filing our taxes for the previous year. Let's see. Just want to also clarify one other thing, that the CTC applies to children who are under age 17, not 18, at the end of the tax year. So that's December 31st. Just want to make sure. There were some proposals to raise that age. That did not happen. Let's see. Let's do what Gabrielle is around to ask a question. I have a few questions around clarifying the tax mandate. This individual said, if I understood correctly, people will still need to have insurance, but will not be penalized for having one. Gabrielle, can you answer that question?
Sure. It's a little unclear. I mean, that's my understanding as well, that unless people are eligible for an exemption from the individual mandate, they will be legally required to have insurance. But if they don't, there won't be any monetary penalty. You know, unclear what the consequences of not having insurance you're required to have would be otherwise. But again, we're waiting for direction from the IRS, which might provide some clarification about any changes in people's requirements to file reporting their coverage.
That's helpful. Thanks, Gabrielle. And I think we still have a lot of unanswered questions since a lot of these changes are new. Another question about tax credits from the brilliant Francine Littman writes, do DACA recipients who lose status qualify for the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit? And if not, what about for authorized work during the year? And how is it analyzed given that EITC is not prorated? Will a DACA social security number qualify for the child tax credit? It's a great question. So the way the law is written for the EITC, which was true before the tax bill changed, the EITC requires a social security number that is valid for employment and that is issued before the due date of the tax return, including extensions. So in order to claim the EITC, your social security number must be valid for employment. now is an interesting question. Well, what happened if I lost my work authorization in the middle of the year? You know, the EITC isn't prorated. So one answer is, well, do I qualify? If you're, according to the way the law is written and guidance from Social Security, from IRS on their website, you are not eligible for your for the EITC if your Social Security number at the time of filing is not work authorized. So let's say you had DACA and you lost work authorization, you would also lose eligibility for the ITC. I mean, I think that could be seen as tremendously unfair. What if you lost your work authorization in November and you file and suddenly you've lost 11 months worth of EITC? We can double check this, but as far as I'm aware, there is no way for the IRS to check whether or not your work was, your Social Security number changed, your work authorization changed during the year. I think they do my understanding is that they do a one-time check of your Social Security number that is for the work authorization of that Social Security number at the time of, that you're filing the taxes. Actually, we don't really, I mean, I think that we have a lot of questions about how they do the checking of the Social Security number, but the guidance and the statute is pretty clear. Similarly, will a DACA Social Security number qualify for the child tax credit? In the recently passed bill, it refers to the provision of the section of the Social Security Act that says that in order to receive the benefit, you must also have work authorization. And so under the Act, you would not be able to receive the child tax credit or earned income tax credit. Is there a system at IRS to check work authorization for Social Security numbers? We don't really know this exactly. We know what the statute says, but there are several different types of Social Security numbers. There's, I think, a bit of confusion sort of among advocates around how those databases are checked. But we'd definitely be happy to follow up with that. Next question. This is maybe one for an easy one for John. Does the ITIN expire if obtained in 2015 to file a 2013 return, but it hasn't been used once?
So if that question is if an attempt is made to file a return for 2013, but the ITIN has not been used since 2013, well, the ITIN will have expired, and what will happen, I think, is that the IRS will treat that 2013 return just like it would treat a current year return where the ITIN had expired. And the person will get a notice that the ITIN has expired, the return is accepted, but refunds are delayed until you go through the process of renewing the ITIN.
Great. And then two other questions relating to identity documents. One is, are original ID documents still required for ITIN renewal?
Yes.
Yes, right.
That is why it's, with the exception that the IRS offices and the certified acceptance agents can view these required original documents, and copies will be sent rather than sending the actual physical original to the IRS with the application. But the original document is required in the first place in either case.
And again, we really recommend that folks, if they live near a certified acceptance agent that can certify original documents, that people really do that in person rather than risking putting maybe the only identity documents they have in the mail and having them get lost. And there's a list of places you can do that on the IRS website. Another question I actually don't know the answer to. The Mexican consulate is offering certified birth certificates online. Will those be accepted by the IRS for the new ITIN applications and renewals? John, do you know the answer to that?
I don't have a final answer to that. I heard that was in the works, but I'm not sure. And a lot of these questions, it'll be helpful to go to or at least call a certified acceptance agent at the least, to get answers to detailed filing questions like that, because they will be the ones who are, most aware of what documents are considered acceptable by the IRS and from what source.
Helpful. Yes, I got the question again, just to repeat that if I have DACA and my DACA work authorization expires, do I use my old ITIN to file taxes? No, once you have your social security number, it's your number, that ITIN is no longer valid, just as a reminder about that. Someone else asks, if a client files returns in one of the past 3 years, does that break the renewal requirement? That's for John.
Yes, if they filed in 2014, 15, or 16, they're not on the list unless their middle digits are one of those 4 groups that I mentioned: 70, 71, 72, or 80. That applies to people whether they've been filing every year or not. But for people who haven't been filing on a regular basis, but they did at least once in that 3-year period, they're still okay. IRS is looking for 0 out of 3 years.
Great. So here we go. A lot of questions. We may not be able to answer all of them right now, so I'm going to probably have to answer you guys after we are done. But we had a few questions around: are certified acceptance agents at IRS offices? Are they independent from IRS offices? And is it preferable for someone to go to a IRS office rather than doing it themselves? And what are the risks associated with them? John, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start with that. No, the certified acceptance agents are not hosted in IRS offices. They are independent. They're usually private return preparation businesses. Several of the chains like H&R Block and so forth handle this kind of work. And then I mentioned that there were free volunteer income tax assistance sites that have been certified to do this work. And so that's all external to the IRS. I would say that given the degree of detail involved in this, unless by reading through the instructions, someone feels, oh, okay, here are the 2 or 3 documents that I need, and I'm just going to go ahead and mail it to the IRS, and they're confident that they know what they're doing, then that's an easy way to do it. If they're not so sure, then checking out whether the IRS office is someplace you want to go, number one, for security purposes, or checking the list to see if there's a certified acceptance agent or any kind of acceptance agent near you that can help you with the ins and outs of what the instructions are telling you to do. That would be the wise approach.
Let's see, we have 1 minute left. Creative solutions for those without a social security number seeking the ITC or the CTC. I'm not aware of any such. So again, with the questions around one issue that was not raised: what are the risks of using the W-2 with an invalid social security number and filing income taxes with the ITIN? That's called a mismatch or no match. And what happens in that situation, if you send in a W-2 with one social security number and you're filing with an ITIN that's different, that is actually allowed. So unlike a invalid, if you send in an invalid ITIN number, that'll bounce back. But if your employer has one social security number on file for you and you are filing with an ITIN and that does not match, they will accept those. So that's important to know. there are a lot more questions, and what we will do is we will follow up with folks individually, and also with a list of answers to everyone who attended, so you're all able to benefit from the questions. But we are about a minute over, and I want to respect everyone's time. And I'm sorry we don't have as many clear answers on some of these issues as we would like. Hopefully soon we'll have some major immigration reform and past legalization for folks with DACA and their family members. So a lot of these issues will be resolved. But in the meantime, stay tuned and we will follow up. And thanks to my fellow panelists.